Welcome, everyone, to this G20 Interfaith Forum Anti-Racism Initiatives webinar. My name is Audrey Kitagawa, and I'm the chair of the Anti-Racism Initiative. The Anti-Racism Initiative explores the ramifications of racism in historical as well as contemporary contexts and the institutional, systematic, and structural ways in which racism and discrimination are manifested and perpetuated. Today, our panelists will address religicide and examine the religious, ethnic, and racial violence that is on the rise. We are privileged to have with us today the two authors of the book, Religicide, Confronting the Roots of Anti-Religious Violence. In their book, Dr. Georgette Bennett and Jerry White define religicide as a systematic attempt to eradicate a religion and its followers through forms of persecution that destroy their heritage, culture, and hope, and is designed to wipe out an entire religious community. They maintained that the current international legal instruments, including the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which identified some of the most serious crimes committed in conflicts, which include war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing, have gaps that do not cover religicide. They assert that two other crimes associated with religicide, ecocide and facticide, have now become important to examine in the context of our contemporary times. Ecocide, the destruction of natural habitats, villages, and cities, has devastating consequences. In this Anthropocene age, 8 billion people now living on Earth have caused the rapid depletion of limited resources, environmental degradation, climate change, and the extinction of hundreds of species every day, which are posing existential threats to all of us. Facticide is a distortion of truth and dissemination of falsehood in the era of social and other digital media, where viral, unchecked falsehoods can quickly and dangerously create societally destabilizing and destructive consequences. We will hear from Sister Macrina Finlay, who will share her personal experiences of assisting members of the Yazidis, an endogamous, displaced, and brutalized group who are indigenous to Kurdistan, a geographical region in Western Asia that includes parts of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. We will also hear from Karen Volker, who will share her perspectives and important work on preventing violence at the community level and defending human rights. You can see all of our panelists' bios in the chat box. Our first speaker today is Dr. Georgette Bennett, founder of the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding and the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. Dr. Bennett, welcome, and you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for this forum in which we can discuss a very, very important and largely unrecognized subject. So I think I'd like to begin my remarks just by saying that I guess this issue vividly came up for me as I was wandering alone among the desolate bunkers of the Birkenau concentration camp, part of the Auschwitz complex outside Krakow, Poland. This is where my grandparents literally went up in smoke. Now, most of my family were killed in death factories like this. I think of it as the industrialization of killing. My parents were among the few who survived the prisons and other horrors, and we arrived in the US as stateless refugees. But even now, 71 years later, I remain fascinated with religion and the violence that religion inspires, especially against Jews. Was the Holocaust the first modern religicide? Probably. It was, after all, an attempt to wipe out an entire people. And the Holocaust led to the codification in law of two forms of human rights violations, crimes against humanity and genocide. An earlier law, which dates back to the 1800s, is war crimes. And in the 1990s, Bosnia contributed another term to our vocabulary, ethnic cleansing. And although never codified in international law, it has been recognized by the International Criminal Court. But here's the thing. None of these terms fully encompass religicide. As was said in the introduction, religicide means the attempt to wipe out an entire religion, its adherents, its habitats, and sacred spaces, its entire cultural heritage. So it goes beyond the 4 human rights violations that I mentioned before. It includes ecocide and facticide and often suicide, and Jerry White will be talking about that later. As was also mentioned, religicide slips between the cracks of our current human rights infrastructure, and as such, it goes unrecognized, unprosecuted, and unabated. But in order to end it, we first have to name it. And once we name it, we need to understand how it begins, with hate speech. There's an inexorable link between verbal violence and physical violence. It starts with dehumanizing the other, with words: swine, kike, nigger, towelhead, filth, ape, parasite, fags, words that empty others of their humanity and reduce them to a caricature filled with contempt. And that kind of psychic numbing makes it easy to swing that hate-filled caricature from a lynching tree, or to shove them into the fires of a Nazi oven, or shoot them at prayer in a mosque in New Zealand. And then there's the politics of the ultra-right with its anti-refugee rhetoric that pervades public policy. Think words like infestation and invasion. Ironically, the core precepts of each of the great religions are rooted in love, peace, and respect. But it's also in religion that one finds the roots of hate speech. It's called group narcissism, the idea that one's own group holds a monopoly on truth. It's grounded in apocalyptic thinking that divides the world into the children of light and the children of darkness. So by virtue of being Black, foreign, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, liberal, or gay, a person can be branded as impure and therefore fair game for bigoted scourges. American history is replete with linkages between moral fervor and physical violence, from the pious Puritans who burnt their witches, to the Ku Klux Klan who burnt their crosses, to neo-Nazis who march in Charlottesville proclaiming Jews will not replace us. And world history gives us many more examples. You need only look at the genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda, genocides that began with leaders spewing hate speech. Now, other forms of violence in the world are decreasing, but anti-religious violence is growing fast, and its perpetrators literally get away with murder in full view of the world. How do they do it? Well, there are hundreds of intertwined laws, resolutions, declarations, and mandates that are designed to protect our right to believe what we want, and how we want, and where we want, including the 30 articles of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And yet, virtually all these rights are violated by governments and non-state actors that perpetrate religicide and other human rights abuses. And this happens every day. That's because declarations, unlike conventions and treaties, are not legally binding. And even though conventions and treaties are legally binding, they often can't be enforced. So there are plenty of all of the above that protect aspects of religicide, but we're advocating for this new category of human rights abuse because there's nothing that completely covers it. So let me give you a few examples of the cracks through which religicide slips. In the 1960s, the UN General Assembly debated race and religion, even though both were already supposedly covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, at the time, many countries in the global South and West were advocating strongly for an international framework to end anti-religious intolerance and violence. But communist states preferred criticizing the West for its systemic racism to advancing any religious freedoms back home. But in 1981, the General Assembly finally ratified a watered-down resolution on eliminating intolerance based on religion or belief. But it was enacted as a declaration. So like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it lacks the force of law. In 1967, there was a UN debate on whether incitement to hatred should be subject to punishment. The US objected, but Israel and many European countries supported its inclusion. But in the end, it was left to governments to prevent and end discrimination. By making it a local decision, it was naively assumed that countries would police themselves, and that's how the UN sidestepped requests by several member states to make religious discrimination a crime punishable by law. Now, international human rights law and the UN statutes are directed at states. But what about non-state actors like ISIS? ISIS perpetrated a horrific regicide against the Yazidis in Iraq, which Sister Macrina will be discussing in detail. Yet there's nothing in the existing statutes that brings ISIS to justice. In cases like that, we're dependent on states to act, some of which are failed, some of which are authoritarian, some of which lack in legitimacy. Facticide, which Jerry White will be talking about, includes hate speech, disinformation, and incitement. It's a key feature of religicide. And Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, states are obligated to forbid, quote, any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. But states aren't obligated to criminalize such kinds of expressions. So ironically, when statutes are used to criminalize incitement, they're often aimed at civil society human rights activists rather than the perpetrators of anti-religious violence. Just look at China's crackdown on Hong Kong. Now, it's true that hate speech is hard to define, which makes it hard to prosecute without violating freedom of expression. International and US laws don't prohibit hate speech. They only prohibit incitement to violence. And the criminal justice system can only deal with the consequences of hate speech after it turns into a hate crime or mass atrocity. Now, as of now, 33 countries, plus the Council of Europe, have enacted hate crime legislation. But most of what's ruled illegal in these countries would be considered protected free speech in the US. So although the US has no national hate speech statutes, 47 of our 50 US states have enacted hate crimes legislation. And yet, hate speech is precisely the point at which we need to intervene in order to prevent religicide. And Karen Volker will be talking to us about that later. So in criminalizing and prosecuting incitement to violence against religious groups, we run into more gaps in international law and find more roadblocks in bringing perpetrators to justice. Human rights law specifies the legal duty of states, but the International Criminal Court tries persons, not states or organizations or groups. The ICC can only try persons whose crimes were at the time committed under the jurisdiction of the court. And these crimes are limited to genocide and the other three that were mentioned earlier. And there's an escape hatch. Any member state can declare that it wasn't subject to the jurisdiction of the court when a crime was committed. The destruction of cultural heritage is also protected, but there's a catch. That property has to be registered and marked with a specific emblem for protection. And it doesn't cover cemeteries or sacred books, or so many of those individual objects of worship that are used by people. But perhaps the biggest obstacle to ending religicide is the UN Security Council. Each permanent member has the right to veto any action brought before the council, and all actions must be unanimously approved. But when two of the greatest human rights violators in the world, Russia and China, sit on that council and veto any actions that are against their interest, that body is effectively crippled. But given all these gaps and obstacles in international bodies and laws, religious leaders and civil society have a special role in stopping religicide. And that's what we're going to be hearing about later in this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett. And we will have our next speaker, Jerry White. He is the Executive Director of United Religions Initiative, and he shares in the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. Jerry, you now have the floor. Please share with us.
Thank you so much, Audrey, and for the team here, and Georgette, for just a powerful thing to this webinar on how do we confront the roots of anti-religious violence and end religicide in our day. So Georgette is my co-author and one of the people I admire most in the world. Thank you for your leadership and conviction, so articulately expressed. So with that, I think I'll maybe be a little more pedantic and maybe share my screen having to do with some of these topics. So you heard that religicide has these three hallmarks, right? Facticide, genocide, which I would include in that, like destruction of community and particularly targeting women, or what can be called femicide, and also ecocide. And it's this Venn diagram, of why things are falling through the crack, that in fact, when you're eliminating a religion and its people and its culture and its rituals and its community, all these things are at play at the same time. So yeah, we heard from Georgette and others. What do you do about a burnt out Coptic church? Who's responsible? Is there anyone rebuilding this? What do you say to these families about the heritage and the place that's being attacked? So I'm going to focus a little more on that piece. What do we do about places, sacred heritage, and how we tell our stories? A Sufi Library in Libya. When your books are destroyed, when your scriptures are robbed from you, when your history is obliterated, or people try to wipe it out or tell you what you can say or not, what does the world do about that? What about the lungs of the planet, the Amazon? What do we do when our habitats are being chopped down? So it's, for all of us who live on Mother Earth, but also for the indigenous groups around the world who have suffered most and are historically marginalized through the process of religicide taking place over centuries. What do we say to one of the leading victims, the earth and living beings on it? How do we address that, particularly when it's religiously motivated, the attack on spiritual communities, as well as the attack on their habitat and where they live? So just as a summary slide that we can share afterwards, putting it all in one place, religicide we've described as the destruction and attempt to eradicate a whole religion, followers, the heritage, the cultures, including indigenous communities as an obvious example. And that requires the facticide that Georgette talked about, like the destruction of truth, the lies. Or we'll hear from Sister Macrina, if you're calling Yazidis, if ISIS is calling Yazidis devil worshippers, continuing a lie about their history, their truth, their religion, you're a few steps away from the hate speech and the type of dehumanized characterizations that Georgette spoke about earlier. So what does it mean in this day and age when we disseminate digitally these falsehoods? What's the antidote to facticide? That's what I want to look at as well. But we're seeing violence against people in genocide, against the planet in ecocide, and against truth in facticide. What do we do about that? So this is probably the alternative. You heard that we say, like, religion isn't the problem here. Many people conventionally think that religion is the main cause of violent conflict around the world. Well, I've taught on this issue, we've written about it, and that's just evidentially false. It's conventional wisdom and projection about what people think about religion. But in fact, the truth is it's not the source of most of the problem. Most conflicts come because of like old-fashioned matters of territory and greed and competition and power and politics. But conflicts can be religified, as we're seeing around the world. So it's no doubt that people interpret that religion's a problem. But in fact, what we're arguing is religion and spirituality are key to getting out of the problem. These are energies and communities that are key to peace building. So we need to reconnect people to nature, spiritual wisdom, altruism, all the things that religion and spirituality and community do so well, peace, justice, and healing. That's what we're looking for. So this is not just bringing you the bad news. We're trying to say what are ways and that we can actually go to heal and recover. So that includes regenerative farming, land, soil, the Amazon, like replanting and restoring natural habitats where religious and spiritual communities live, speaking truth and having wisdom and storytelling by diverse religious actors, but also reporters. How reporters and the media are characterizing these stories is very important. But even beyond that, literature, poetry, artists, who are the allies in our pro-social media in speaking truth to power and letting the stories go that are not vilifying and scapegoating others. And then, of course, rebuilding communities. We'll hear from Karen Volker and the experience of cure violence as well. How do you interrupt violence when it started, including shutting down retaliation? There are things like with violence present, it's very hard to heal in an emergency like that when your whole life is existentially threatened. So these three dynamics, that's the antidote to religicide, and spirituality and religion provide some of our answers. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who's a friend, is thinking about all of his life's work. He passed during the COVID pandemic. I think it's worth reminding us that violence has nothing to do with religion as such. It has to do with an identity and our groupism, that we survive in groups, and that actually religion has been a source of social evolution and resilience throughout the centuries. And as I said earlier, the conflicts we're facing, the wars, have very little to do with religion as they start, but they are about power and territory. So with that reminder too, we bring on the idea that some people don't know, maybe in the West where you see emptying churches and whatnot, or religious institutions, or lack of trust from youth in their religious leaders, that in fact, the silent majority of the world, 84%, of the world identifies as religious and affiliating with all the great religions that we see here. So that most of us are never going to touch violence, don't want to participate in violence. Very often we're passive bystanders, praying and hoping for peace. And the perpetrators are a really small group of instigators on that scent, people who actually pick up machetes and guns to kill in the name of ideology, politics, or religion. So we have to maybe bring some hope on the fact that most of us are sort of like, we're believers of some sort. We change over the years and we love peace, justice, and healing. Those are values. So I think the power of interfaith community builders is very important for us to look at, and role models in the space who are nonviolent leaders. So the research on religion and resilience shows that the key for community resilience are these things that we can do, that we can build in communities. So, a religion or a community spirituality can offer hope and optimism, altruism, having a moral compass, humor, role models, social support, training, mission, or purpose-centered. So the question for today for youth and for communities is, where do you find all this? Is it at a rock concert? A political rally? When we talk about separation, isolation in the rising generation, how much is done alone or on your phone, it is important to reestablish like rituals of community. And that's why we've survived as a species, is because we've survived in groups, and religion has been part of that. So there's a very positive side to why 84% of the world affiliates with groups. It's called survival, but also these positive aspects of resilience that we have learned from Steve Southwick and Dennis Charney at Yale and Mount Sinai School of Medicine. So why am I here now as the executive director of United Religions Initiative? Well, we have this threefold purpose, which is like perfect for the antidote for religicide, as we've outlined in the book. We want to promote daily relationships that endure across faiths and difference. And so we set up cooperation circles in over 110 countries where people of different faiths work together on very practical action areas. So getting concrete and learning about your neighbors, very important. And then there's this middle piece of how do we actually end religiously motivated violence that's critical to our mission, and then promote these cultures of peace and justice for the earth and all living beings. So I'm proud to represent URI and to be working with our communities all around the world in partnership with many people on this webinar. So lastly, we work in circles. This isn't just top-down work with governments. It's we, the people of diverse faiths, standing in solidarity together. We, the people of diverse faiths, standing to protect cultural heritage and sacred sites around the world, even when they aren't, quote, technically our religion or affiliated with us. We stand in solidarity. We, the people, rebuild, we replant, we replenish and regenerate the soil and the earth together. So important to counter ecocide in our day as a priority. And we, the people of diverse faiths, celebrate indigeneity, like going back in solidarity with Native peoples, tribal peoples who knew the secret of staying connected to spirit, to planet and land, and to community. So we're finding all around the world that those most affected by religiously motivated violence have some of the lessons and the teachings for us to come out of this urgent dilemma that we're facing called religicide. So thank you for being with me on this journey, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues some more.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And we have now Sister Macrina Finlay. She is a Benedictine nun at St. Scholastica Abbey in Kinlage, Germany. Sister Macrina, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Georgette and Jerry for presenting these basics of religicide and why it's so important to define it and also to respond to it in positive ways. Solidarity was the last piece that Jerry White kept emphasizing, and that is also what explains how it is that I became familiar with Yazidis. 2015 and 16, we had the Multicultural in Germany, where I live, and a number of Yazidis came and lived with us. And one of them asked, do you have family here? And I don't, I'm from America. And he told me, well, I want to be your brother. And I said, I want to be your sister. And I learned in a whole new way what it means to be a sister. And I also learned a whole lot more about the Yazidi community and what they've been through over the course, not only of the last 9 years, 8.5 years since the genocide in 2014 by ISIS, but also much longer, going further back. I too will share some slides, in large part so that you can see some of the images, some of the people, some of the places that have become so dear to me. Although I do live in Germany, I also have been able to go to Iraq, especially this past year. I have been doing an intangible culture project with Abraham Path Initiative that's funded by a LEAF Fund, which these are two organizations that very much stand and recognize the importance of cultural preservation and of how much the people and the places they are, if we understand them and we preserve what's important to them, then this is something that for all of us ends up being, a source of thriving. So first off, very quickly, who are the Yazidis? They are an indigenous religious and ethnic minority in what is now called Kurdistan. I work primarily with those in Iraq in Shingal Mountain, and they are really more or less the one group that has been able to stay close to their cultural roots, their farming roots, in large part because of religicide and genocide that has happened over the course of hundreds of years. The population is currently less than 1 million. That I say currently because it wasn't always this way. There were tens of millions of Yazidis, according to most sources, but because of ongoing persecutions over the course of generations and centuries, this number has dwindled substantially. One of the things that makes Yazidis so unique is their own specific social religious structures that they have. I won't go into all of the details of this, but what I find so interesting and important is that everyone and everything sort of has its place. So you do have different groups, and some people compare those to castes. I wouldn't do that. They really go on to define different roles that people have in the community, and they recognize that diversity is essential to thriving. That's something that I've learned from them. One of the things that many people know about them, if they know much about Yazidis, is that they marry within their own groups. I would argue that this is a source of protection in a very hostile environment that they've existed in over the course of centuries. It would be interesting to see what that could look like had their circumstances been different. But that is one of the things that has enabled their survival. They have oral traditions and practices. That means that what gets destroyed now, there is no going back. Which is one of the reasons why it's so important to preserve right now when people still remember, because much can and will get lost if that is not done. One of the things or the primary point that distinguishes Yazidis is that they honor Tawasi Malek, so they are monotheists. Many in the community would say that this is for Abrahamic, so going back a very, very long time in terms of their roots. And they honor the peacock angel. And much of this, as Jerry White said, is what has led many groups to recognize them as people who worship the evil one. Notably, that's exactly the opposite of how they understand of their actual religion, which is what starts getting us to the point of religicide and facticide. So what happened? Really, it's a misrepresentation of their religion and culture over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is when you have people demonizing others, literally, and saying that they are unclean. This is an excuse that's been used many, many times to abuse them, to kill them, and to justify taking land, to justify destruction of culture. So it really is this misrepresentation of the truth that is so pivotal. They have this history of persecution. 1772 genocides is the historical sort of how they described or how they understood their past. I mention this because that has found sort of a balance. They also pray for the 72 nations. Exactly how many genocides this was is really hard to say, but I find it very important that they used this key number and said, yes, the number of times that we've been persecuted, that's the number of groups who we want to pray for before we even begin our own prayers. So there's so much that even in the suffering, they have taken to heart and turned into something quite positive. Notably, in the 70s and 80s, they were displaced from their ancestral villages into collective villages. So this is really where their indigenous roots really started to come under pressure. And then there were two further major attacks in 2007, and then the very famous one in 2014, where ISIS killed and enslaved more than 10,000 people, Yazidis, and displaced the whole community in Shingal nearly, so 400,000. And it's interesting, at this stage, they move away from this sort of holy number of 72, recognizing that the suffering's gone beyond. So they now speak of 74 most of the time. So why is religicide a helpful term in this context? I hope that in some respects that's already become clear because of what's already been shared. But one of the things I've come to see is that Yazidis as a threatened indigenous population require a holistic approach, because this isn't simply a matter of wanting to destroy people, but rather a whole culture, a whole context, and everything that belongs with it and belongs to it. Facticide, I've already said, is the very basis. So recovering the most beautiful elements of Yazidi beliefs, traditions, helping preserve that is certainly a way that is already being attempted, but that needs to be strengthened if we're actually taking serious the need and the desire to support this indigenous community and us, because if we lose their way of life, we've lost a bit of an element of diversity in the world that is of absolute importance. As we see in biodiversity, we can also see in cultural and religious diversity the importance of having different points of view. By genocide, we have to, I think, understand that this was a means to an end of trying to destroy a culture. So as much as it was the destruction of people, the killing of people, enslaving women and children was just as much a part of trying to destroy this culture. And as we think through solutions, that needs to be recognized. Ecocide, the same is true here. As we face the questions of reconstruction and redevelopment, it becomes important to not only help the people, but also preserve the culture, the spaces, and also in this case, the farming culture and community. Without that, the people and the religion and all of the other elements are unable to exist in their natural state. And that is, and the place is also destroyed. So again, it's destruction of the planet. So there's always the microcosmic, the cosmic, and the macrocosmic elements that come together here. But without seeing it holistically, we simply can't make positive and appropriate choices as we attempt to help people in their reconstruction, Yazidis in their reconstruction. So thank you for your attention. And thank you to all of you who are listening. And that's enough.
Thank you so much, Sister Macrina. And Karen Volker, who is our next speaker, is the Director of Partnerships and Violence Prevention at United Religions Initiative. So Karen, please share with us.
Hello, everybody. It's so great to be with you today. I'm going to also use some slides. This is my inaugural activity or event with the United Religions Initiative, having recently left Cure Violence Global. So I'm kind of merging these two worlds, and I'm very excited about being part of this because I really believe that it is possible to interrupt and stop religiously motivated violence. And I'm going to tell you why, and I'm definitely open to questions as we get into the Q&A portion of this seminar webinar. So what does it mean to look at violence through a health lens, right? This is what I picked up in the last 10 years at Cure Violence Global. We view violence as a behavior, which is an important distinction. So it's not about bad people so much bad behavior. if you think of it that way, it opens up new ways of addressing violence. It doesn't just make it rule of law or fighting violence with violence. The second component of a health lens is that it spreads in a contagious manner. It's important to stop that spread, right? And we're going to get into each of these a little bit more later. And the third component, which is extremely important and what makes this urgent, is that it can be prevented. We have to assume, and we shouldn't assume, that we can't do anything about it. And so and I want to also, it can be interrupted. This was a question I had from Sister Macrina the other day. What if it's already started? And the answer is it can be prevented and it can be interrupted and stopped even after it started. So that's not a reason to just shrug your shoulders and say we can't do anything about it. So this approach, as I said, was something that was developed by Dr. Gary Slutkin, who was the founder of Cure Violence Global, and it was adapted from the World Health Organization's approach to stopping epidemics. So it combines neuroscience, epidemiology, and behavioral science, and has been doing this. Cure Violence Global has been doing this for 20 years and has a lot of experience and learned over the years how to do it, but they've also gathered a lot of evidence as to how it works. And so I will talk to you a little bit about how it works and what are the components of that. One of the first things I want to talk about is go back to the idea of behavior. So we know a lot about how behaviors are acquired, maintained, and changed. And in the first 10 years or so of a person's life, it's mostly through imitation and modeling, which you'll see in the top left picture. The next, after adolescence, it really becomes social norms become extremely important. And this is actually why I think that religious actors, and as Jerry calls them, the interfaith community, has so much potential to make a difference here. And there are neurological effects from being exposed to violence, which we won't get into the science of it today, but there's a lot of science behind this idea about behaviors and how they're acquired and maintained and changed, and also about the contagious nature of it. And then, of course, there are modulating factors. So all kinds of programming can be done to help build resilience, and that stuff continues to need to be done, but we do need to also focus on interruption. So the exposure to violence can come through many different means. It's not just one single way. And virtually any form of this could be religiously motivated. So it's important for us and for people who are faith actors, religious leaders, to really understand their potential to work and operate in this field and try to prevent violence from happening in the first place. So the health approach to violence has three main components. Detect and interrupt, which means stop the violence before it happens. You do that through credible messengers. We'll come back to that in a second. Change the behavior of the highest risk. So here it's important to focus on the highest of the high risk for doing violence. The interruption has to happen by people who are close to doing the violence or giving the orders. And it might seem impossible, but if you can figure out who the right people are, and then who are doing the violence that you need to reach, you can probably figure out who are the people who have influence with them. And in our experience, there's always somebody in these circles who really understands that it shouldn't be happening, who's already thinking we should be doing something to stop this. And what we have to do is figure out who those people are. When I say we here, it's not people on the outside like us, but figuring out who are the people on the inside, getting them to reach those people. So it's really a process of analysis that gets you closer and closer to the people that you need to reach. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that we can impose from the outside, but there is a process and a method for doing this. And that's what we need to think about and focus on. And the norms are extremely important, especially with religiously motivated violence. So it happens when this type of violence is happening in those places where it's happening, because it doesn't happen everywhere. We know that. We live mostly in a peaceful world, but where it's happening in a context in which it's become normal or accepted. And we need to push back against that. These norms are important to change. And I believe that faith leaders and actors can change these norms. So this is something that can be happening while we're trying to interrupt. It doesn't have to be sequential or anything like that. These are things that can be happening sort of at any time, right? So as you apply this approach, the health approach, the detection and interruption is urgent, and we need to be focused on that at whatever level we can do that, in whatever way we can do that. But we don't need to wait for that to happen to change the behavior and the focus on those people and be figuring out where we need to focus, right? So you don't do this everywhere. You do it in those pockets where you have the highest problem. That's where you're going to have the greatest impact. And then you want to change the norms. And as I said, religious or faith actors are well positioned to do. So I want to come back to something that Sister Macrina said, which is that you need a holistic approach. So what I've been talking about is very much community-led and at that local level and sort of like middle out or bottom up. But the top down, I think, is also going to be very important, which is what Georgette started with. We need, and what Jerry talks about a lot, is like we also need at governmental level, at a multilateral level, some sort of treaty that recognizes religicide, that brings this problem to the forefront so that people are focused on it and believe that it is something that we can do something about and that we should do something about. And so with that, I am happy to be part of this presentation, and we'll stop sharing my screen and ready to answer questions.
Thank you so much. And while we have you holding the floor, we have a question from Monica Willard, and she asks, who is getting the training to interrupt violence? And are there classes in seminaries? And maybe Sister Macrina, you can answer that. And religious, this training in religious institutions. And are diplomats also trained in this? So Karen, why don't you answer the question?
Thank you, Monica, for that question. Right now, as far as I know, nobody's being trained specifically to interrupt religicide or religiously motivated violence. But I love the question because it's exactly how we need to be thinking. If we work through networks, it's not one person at a time, but how do you get it into a system? And this kind of like some people might call this top down, it might be middle out. But if you have a systemic approach, you go into the seminaries, you go into the diplomatic corps, you go into like the UN peacekeepers and train them, right? Like there's multiple entry points where you could have an impact and reach a lot of people at once to get them thinking about this. The more people we have thinking this is their problem to address and that there's something they can do about it, the quicker we'll get to a solution on this problem.
I'd like to build on Karen's answer. Actually, the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding has as one of its signature programs, Peacemakers in Action. And what we have been doing is exactly that, preparing material based on their case studies to both be used in seminaries to train people who are entering the religious life in conflict resolution and peace making skills, and to train diplomats in how to work with religious actors, because I can't emphasize enough, I want to underscore what Karen said about that. Religious actors are absolutely key players in this for a number of reasons.
Thank you so much. And while you have the floor, Georgette, I wanted to ask you, is there any way that our audience, our listeners, could learn more about this program from the Tannenbaum Center?
Well, it's very easy. There's a website, tannenbaum.org. Tannenbaum is spelled with one N, TANENBAUM.org. Also, Cambridge University Press has published 2 books of our case studies called Peacemakers in Action, Profiles in Religious Peacemaking. And that is available on Amazon and elsewhere.
Thank you so much. We have another question from the audience. What can we as individuals do to make the most difference? And Sister Macrina, perhaps you can answer that, since you have also been on the ground in dealing with the Yazidi community.
The best thing I would say is to start as close to home as you possibly can. I became involved with the Yazidi community because they came to Germany. And so my choice had a lot to do with who it was that I was closest to, even geographically. So there are generally marginalized people in your communities that sometimes come from areas that end up leading you across the world in terms of your thoughts and in your understandings. But in my experience, it's very helpful to actually know individuals, to get to know the communities themselves, whether they are in their homeland, or much easier, I think, for most of us, in our own communities, and then ask them, start talking with them about what their needs are, what their dreams are, what their hopes are, what are the challenges that they see, because very often they're coming from perspectives that are very different than ours because their experiences are different. And bringing those experiences together is often a very, very fruitful way to move forward.
Thank you so much, Sister. And Karen, I think you have some light to shed on this as well. So please.
Just like to add to that, I think that anyone and everyone, so the participants in this webinar and all of your friends, you can do what you can to push back against hate speech, to call it out, to name it when you see it, and not just let it go by. You can demand from your own, if you are a member of a faith community, you can request, demand from your own faith leaders that they speak out against religiously motivated violence. And you can do this among your friends and family. That doesn't have to just be with religious leaders. We need to, as I like to say, gently shake the shoulders of the world, right? And get everyone to really focus on this issue. And that was a paraphrase from Gandhi, but so it's not mine, but I really think it's possible, and that's what we all need to try to do. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And another question from the audience, as Charles Barker indicated, that he's quite intrigued by the use of the health model and epidemiological approach to the prevention or cure of violence, and viewing violence as a contagion like a virus, as you pointed out, Georgette. And he feels that likewise, one could look at the value of compassion and compassionate action as a cure for this epidemic, not an overnight cure. So he indicates perhaps love and compassion can be looked upon as a vaccine. So these are good points that he's raising. Of course, all of our spiritual traditions also teach the important aspects of love and compassion. And for example, he mentions the Global Health Face Group and has embraced the idea of compassion as key to accomplishment of the UN SDG goals. And he wants to know your thoughts on this, please. Who would like to share? Jerry, perhaps?
I think that's a beautiful understanding that peace begins with us. As you know, from you are I, we talk about you are I, and we're all connected in this work to reduce religiously motivated violence and to interrupt it, as Karen so eloquently put forth. A few things I think about all of us as leaders, and it's not like waiting for someone to solve the problems. So what is our role, I think, is the question. How do we show compassion in action as a healing force in the world? And my mentors or philosophy has been, number one, how do we learn to listen deeply and see the patterns and hear what's happening, even beyond the words? The second role of any leader or ourselves would be how to speak or communicate responsibly, and, showing that you've listened in different cultures and contexts. And then how do we disrupt or interrupt disempowering conversations or actions. That's the third piece. So we have everything from sexism to racism to religicidism to so many awful things to work on. And it's in standing in our compassion and with love and dignity all around us that we can do our best, most powerful work. And that's why I think URI is so well positioned in creating interfaith circles that are all about peace, justice, and healing. Those are the three values we stand in. It's about working together for daily action that's with interfaith groups on anything you may choose. So we practice as leaders in small things and big things. So compassion in action could be repairing the local water well, or making sure people have access to care. Persons with disabilities can get to their doctor's appointment. I mean, there's so many ways where we practice our community leadership. And then I think as we come up from our personal role to the community role, I think we're also hearing there's a role for that middle out. What is it what coalitions can we build? What partners and allies can we join forces with beyond just interfaith, the choir of interfaith groups, or even us on this call? Who do we engage as allies? I think it's sort of in Macrina, maybe you could answer this. When you expect, my experience as a landmine survivor, for example, when we worked on the campaign to ban landmines, was that the survivor voice of all these amputees all around the world was very powerful and important. And it caught the idea, the attention of the Princess of Wales to work with us as survivors on this humanitarian mission. But survivors on their own could not have affected a landmine ban treaty. We were just a piece of the puzzle, putting a human face and a voice to the survivor experience and the devastation caused by landmines. In this case, when I think of survivors of religiously motivated violence or survivors of religicide, like we heard about the Yazidis, it's too much to put on them when they're struggling for their very existence and survival. So they must be front and center in part of the solution, but they need allies and coalitions to work with us. So we need to build together a coalition like we did in the landmine movement of 1,200 organizations in over 120 countries that were like-minded and focused on a ban against the use and production and sale of anti-personnel mines. So maybe the analogy is apt, and the survivors have a role, but so does civil society, and ultimately partners in governments. Nation states have a role as well, as we heard from Georgette Bennett, how important the international system is. But with all those gaps, unless we, the people from the communities, are actually speaking out, I don't think we can solve this. So to reiterate what Karen was saying, to top down, bottom up, middle out processes simultaneously are super important. But I turn back to Sister Macrina and say, what are the Yazidis telling you? How do they want help and support?
Sister Macrina, you have the floor.
With the Yazidi community in particular, and I'm speaking specifically of the community from Shingal, the vast majority wants to return home. And there are really two steps of that in their case. And this is something that has been very important for me to learn, is listen to history. Don't think that I know at the very beginning when they say we want to go home, what does that mean? Because for many, that means not going back to the collective villages into which they were displaced in the 70s and 80s, but rather to Mount Shingal itself, which is their spiritual home, which is their space of protection. And so the obvious answer that is actually being implemented for the most part right now isn't necessarily the one that is coming from the community. So really a focus, they also want hospitals and schools and very, very practical things. And they want to be heard, and they want justice. And they want to be seen, I think, as a whole community. So to recognize that when you understand yourself as a whole community and being so connected with one another, when 2,700 women and children from your community are still enslaved, that isn't only affecting the surviving immediate relatives, but the entire community. And so there's a number of these elements that are not necessarily easy to see immediately, that come only with listening and responding. And more than anything, they want international and national solidarity. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want justice, which for them means primarily being able to live in their spaces and have a normal life as they did earlier. So the focus that we place on the ISIS crimes is very, very important, but not necessarily the most important to many of the people who are without homes and who are displaced from their homeland, and who in most cases are spread in terms of family units between Shingal, Kurdistan, and Germany. So listening to those needs and the needs of not being able to be together as a community, and then saying, okay, how do we respond to that in practical terms? So this is, again, one instance, but some of the answers might be surprising given the emphasis that is often present in policies.
So thank you so much, Sister Macrina. And while we are talking about the Yazidis, Wendy Goldberg from the Tri-Faith Initiative in Omaha, Nebraska, indicates that the largest community of Yazidis in the United States is in Lincoln, Nebraska. They have about 5,000 to 7,000 Yazidis in the community. And she flags that if you wish to get involved in supporting them, and this is for our audience as well, please feel free to contact Wendy Goldberg at the Tri-Faith Initiative, Omaha, Nebraska. And, it's really wonderful to hear the interfaith representatives that we have listening in to this webinar, and to hear what they are undertaking to help communities in need. So thank you so much. And from Janet, she says she's a member of Interfaith Paths to Peace in Louisville, Kentucky. And she indicates that they are training interrupters to work in their neighborhoods to interrupt gun violence, where it is happening on a daily basis. And she indicates it's not religious violence, but it certainly can apply. So, it is very important that we be able to understand the nature of violence. And of course, Georgette, you were stressing the importance of being able to really understand the nature of how this violence arises. So while I have the attention focused on you, Dr. Bennett, can you shared about the gaps in international law that allow religicide to occur in plain sight without it being prosecuted. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, the gaps are extensive, both in international humanitarian law and international criminal law, and also international refugee law. They kind of all come together in not being able to address this issue. And part of the reason for that is what I said earlier, that the various resolutions and so on, so many of them are not, don't have the force of law. And many of those that do have the force of law are not enforceable. There are some mechanisms if the Security Council cannot act on something after a period of time. There are some very awkward, rarely used mechanisms to kick it over to the General Assembly. But it's difficult to get things done there too because of the large number of nations. But so much of this goes back to the idea of national sovereignty, which began with the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was a treaty that came about to end the religious wars in Europe centuries ago. And what that did was it privatized religion, which is a good thing. But by virtue of privatizing religion and separating it from the state, it elevated the sovereignty of the state above all else. And that elevation of the sovereignty of the state is the international norm that rules us to this day after all these centuries. But unfortunately, that doesn't make the state responsible, or it doesn't mean that the state is accountable for protecting the well-being of the people in that state. So you get the privilege of sovereignty, but then you can do whatever you want to your people. And unless it's something that crosses into other borders, the international community has no right to intervene. So when you have a situation like the Uyghurs and the Tibetan Buddhists in China, well, that's all happening within the state. And there's nothing you can do. You can mobilize public opinion, you can impose sanctions, you can have businesses stop using slave labor as part of their supply chains. You can do those things. And then you have the gap into which non-state actors fall. What do you do with ISIS? And what do you do when you have an international system of criminal justice where only individuals can be prosecuted? Well, maybe you can then do something about Bashar al-Assad and what he's doing to his people. But what do you do about Russia? And what do you do about Iran? They can't be prosecuted as state entities. So you have all of these contradictions and obstacles and gaps that basically means we have a system tied up in knots, despite all the good intentions, despite all the aspirational declarations that we have.
So thank you so much, Dr. Bennett. Now, Jerry, in the book, you talk about, you and Dr. Bennett talk about the need for an interreligious treaty, a covenant. So can you share a little bit more about what a global covenant of religions would look like?
I think it's, as Georgette and others have said, this is a cross-border issue. So on one hand, it's happening inside borders, but people of good faith are from all, cross borders. It goes beyond the nation state, like how you affiliate with your faith. So I think having a peace building, interfaith army of sorts is super important to be the conscience of the world and to hold nation states more accountable. So from our experience in the past, even on a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, which I helped co-lead and negotiate, there's an analogy here for us to think about. One was you had, let's say the union of people with vision loss or blind, or people with hearing loss or deaf, or physical disabilities in wheelchairs. You had almost different types of disabilities, almost functioning as their own religions with their special needs. And so although the international human rights law talked about helping people, just like women or certain identities or people with disabilities, and that we can't discriminate against them, the system was sort of treating them by dividing and conquering them. So until you got the disability groups together to form an international disability alliance to take their seat at the table collectively in the human rights dialogue, there was actually no progress. Like no one group, blind, deaf, physical, or others, could do the job on their own. Similarly here, there's no one group. If we're just talking about the Rohingya over here, the Yazidis over there, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Coptics, the Baha'i, the indigenous groups we know, on their own, the world has divided and conquered them and stole and abused them. So it's in pulling together a coalition of these survivor groups, as well as their allies across all faiths, to stand up and make sure that we fill in those gaps and hold accountable the missing pieces of international law. So that's why the concept of a missing piece being a global covenant of religions or global covenant of people of good faith and spirituality coalescing together to draw on their wisdom and their traditions, but for the best of their faiths, and to actually pursue justice and peace and healing with the nations and with our allies. So a global covenant sounds like it could be something like an interreligious peace treaty, but that plays into thinking as if religion is the main problem. What we need to is like an interreligious coalition and spirit that calls the nation states into account for all the laws and policies that they are not adhering to. So in fact, we need to have a strategy that is accountability of nation states, where we, the people of good faith, call on that action, and survivors across boundaries and borders work together with their allies. And then I think there is something that gets beyond the original vision of URI.org was this thought that there would be a united religions initiative, that people of faith, that they were ready to do that. And back in the between 1997 and 2000, when the concept and the vision was being birthed, as you know, Audrey, with so many good people, it thought, well, it doesn't seem like the world leaders are ready. They don't seem to care about the people. So we need to go to the communities, to people, individuals of faith to work together. And that's why over the last 20 years, we've been building this network and movement of interfaith grassroots circles in over 110 countries. So it's like a starter kit, but again, on its own, community-based work can be very fragile. As we saw in World War II, Georgette started with the memories of Shoah and the Holocaust. We need to band together, is my point, that in fact, all the groups, during World War II, we didn't have allies come together at a nation state level, as well as allies, we would like to see allies of the survivor groups. Otherwise, by dividing Roma and Jews and people with disabilities and gays and destroying them all, we need to pull those together. There are history lessons as we move towards what I would call a global covenant of religion. At the time, the world needs groups like the Tannenbaum Center, like Cure Violence, to work together. And lastly, the other challenge we face in creating a global covenant of, for peace building among religions and nation states is that the UN and all of us are very siloed in our work. As we heard, religicide is about media. So where do you deal with hate speech? That's one portion of the UN, or genocide office, or the High Commissioner for Human Rights office. On the other hand, we're saying it's ecocide. So what about the environmental programs, and where's that showing up at the UN or with nonprofits or NGOs? And then what about other areas like peacekeeping and peace building, or human security, a whole other category? So what we see is when there's something as desperate in the world as combating religicide, and it has three main areas. People tend to deal with these in silos themselves, bureaucratically, in terms of funding, and in terms of the nonprofit industrial complex, how we all find our specialties. And this is a time, as I think someone said earlier, for holistic responses that transcend the current systems, so we can unite together to solve the problem and advance peace, justice, and healing. Not in an airy-fairy way, but as we heard from Karen and the others, in a very concrete, life-saving way that celebrates polyculture and biodiversity and what's best about creation on Mother Earth, that we're all different and our rights need to be respected to pray and believe and change and evolve differently over time. And so I think that's super important. So I know I went on for a little bit too long here. There are many elements to this, as we describe in the book on religicide, particularly in the last chapter, but it was more an invitation for this type of conversation, Audrey, like a starter kit to say, where can we go next? What are the creative ideas of people on this call to start to band together for the good of the planet and its people?
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was quite comprehensive. So I also consider those comments to be your conclusory comments. And we will now go into conclusory comments, and I close the question and answer period. Thank you so much to our audience for participating. And let's begin with you, Georgette, your conclusory comments, what you'd like for our audience to take away.
Thank you. One of the themes that has come up a number of times over the course of this conversation is, what can we do? How can we help? And I think Karen very pointedly made the observation that It begins with us as individuals, and individuals can make a difference. So I would like, in conclusion, to just share a formula that I have applied to all of the situations where I have been a change agent and have wanted to make a difference. And the formula is very simple. Find an entry point, identify a gap that isn't being filled, and find something doable with which to fill that gap. And then stay tightly focused on that. Because if you don't do that, and you look at the big picture, you just get paralyzed into inaction. But if you find an entry point, identify a gap, fill that gap with something doable, you will no longer be paralyzed. You will be able to do something to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennett. So, Sister Macrina, your conclusory comments, please.
I think maybe I'll actually add on to what Georgette just said, because that is so important to find your spot. I've found mine in many respects, at least for the next little while, my involvement with Yazidis, my involvement with regenerative farming, and all of that keeps going out, making waves, getting bigger and bigger in some respects. But as important as finding your spot is recognizing that it's part of a whole. And so with the particular lens that I have, I'm able to see the world clearly from my particular perspective. And the clearer my lens is, the more I understand the context, the more I understand the nuances through the microcosmic elements that are my life and the relationships and the communities in which I am involved, the more I am maybe able to see, okay, this is one and it's part of a whole. And it's not necessarily the case that that will make me understand. I hope that what it allows me is reverence for other perspectives and recognizing that they are just as rich and diverse, and that they have as much to bring, and that if we come together, each of us with what we have, and we bring it together, that's where true change and true regeneration can actually happen, and where something like religicide can actually start to be combated.
Thank you so much, Sister. So, Karen.
Thank you very much. So I would love to leave the audience with a sense of hope, a sense of possibility, and also a sense of urgency. And the urgency here is specifically to interrupt and stop violence. So there's a lot of stuff we can do to stop violence from happening next year, in the years to come, building resilient societies, et cetera. But let's also put on our plate an urgency about preventing violence today, tonight, and tomorrow. Any violence that happens should not be okay. So I want to just really emphasize that. And then on a maybe more positive note, I'd like to share two sayings that I've carried with me. This might give away a little bit my age. Since 1981, when I was an exchange student in my junior year abroad in college. And the two sayings are, one is, ideals are like the stars. We never reach them, but they guide our path. And the second one is that free are those who are not afraid to reach the end of their thoughts. These have been my guiding principles. I've carried them, I put them up in every office I've ever had. And I think we need that kind of faith and belief in possibility in order to tackle something as daunting as religicide. Otherwise, it just seems too impossible. So just encourage people to take that away with them.
Thank you so much, Karen. And, I really wish to express my deepest appreciation to all of our panelists for participating in this really informative discussion that has provided all of us with so much food for thought and consideration on how to address the growing violence against religious groups that may also have recognized ethnic identities, as we have so richly heard today. And Dr. Bennett and Jerry share, and they maintain that these hostilities and violence are among the fastest growing targets worldwide. And they do posit that the current international legal instruments are not sufficient to prevent or prosecute religicide. They also maintain that their proposal of having an interreligious global covenant is a logical approach for addressing this challenge. And the involvement of religions, indigenous peoples, and victims is essential to create a practical and workable solution. And their approach of having a global covenant leverages the unique strengths of the stakeholders and is a non-competitive way to approach the issue. And may we now, in our own way, be called to remember all those who have been killed, displaced, and impacted by the violence, degradation, and unspeakable suffering of man's inhumanity to man. And may we offer our prayers, service, help, and moments of silence and quietude to remember how much more we must strive to become better people and to be peacemakers, that peace may prevail on earth. And may we also remember that all those who do dedicate their lives, meaning and purpose and work to alleviate the suffering of others and are themselves the exemplar instruments of peace. And we are so appreciative of all of the peacemakers in the world. And I end with a quote from Religicide, that's the book that says, "We stand in solidarity alongside the survivors of religicide, grateful for their tenacity and resilience, pointing the way forward. Our survival as a planet and a people depend upon it." And as a book was dedicated to the survivors of religicide worldwide, so too is today's webinar dedicated to them. And I so appreciate all of you for sharing your insights, your wisdom, your experiences, and your call for all of us to dilate our lens of insularity into the global mind and to take into serious consideration the need for religicide and creating international legal instrument to be able to have it recognized. So I thank all of you for joining us today in this very rich conversation, and I bid you all a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.